What if AI isn't replacing human intelligence, but quietly rewiring the way we use it? Researchers recently noticed something unexpected. People using ChatGPT showed lower brain activity and remembered less of what they had just written. That doesn't prove AI is making us less intelligent, but it does suggest something more subtle. Your brain may be adapting to think less when AI thinks for you. And that raises a bigger question. What happens to a brain that slowly stops practicing parts of its own thinking? To understand that, we need to go back 50 years, to London taxi drivers whose brains physically change with experience. 1. The brain becomes what it repeats. To understand how AI could change the brain, we first need to understand something remarkable about the human mind. Your brain is not fixed. It is constantly reshaping itself based on what you do every day. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience. One of the most famous demonstrations came from London taxi drivers. Unlike most drivers, they had to memorize thousands of streets, landmarks, and routes across one of the world's most complex cities. The training process, known as the knowledge, often took years. When researchers scanned their brains, they discovered something remarkable. A region called the hippocampus, critical for memory and navigation, was measurably different compared to the average person. The longer a driver had spent navigating London streets, the more pronounced these changes became. The brain had physically adapted to the demands placed on it. But neuroplasticity has a second side. The brain doesn't just strengthen what it uses, it also becomes more efficient by reducing resources devoted to abilities that are no longer needed. Throughout life, it continuously reallocates energy toward the tasks it performs most often, which raises an uncomfortable question. If practicing navigation can reshape the brain, what happens when technology begins doing more and more of our thinking for us? And that question leads directly to a phenomenon that existed long before ChatGPT. 2. The beginning of cognitive offloading. Humans have always outsourced mental work. We write appointments in calendars, store phone numbers in smartphones, set reminders for tasks we once had to remember ourselves. This reveals something important. Our brains are not designed to store as much information as possible. They are designed to be efficient. That is why the arrival of Google fascinated researchers. Studies found that when people believe information will always be available later, they invest less effort in remembering it. Instead of remembering the information itself, they often remember where to find it. This phenomenon is known as cognitive offloading. Rather than spending mental resources on a task, we transfer part of it to external systems. And the easier and more reliable those systems become, the more likely we are to rely on them. But ChatGPT introduces something new. Google stores information. AI systems increasingly help organize ideas, summarize complex topics, formulate arguments, and develop solutions. In other words, they no longer support only memory. They support processes much closer to thinking itself. The question is no longer what information we outsource. The question is which mental abilities we no longer need to practice. 3. Are we thinking less? At first glance, this might not seem revolutionary. Humans have outsourced mental work for centuries. Calculators perform arithmetic, search engines store information, calendars remember appointments. So why should AI be different? Because modern AI does not simply provide knowledge. It increasingly participates in the thinking process. In the past, solving a problem required gathering information, comparing possibilities, identifying connections, and forming conclusions. Today, that process often looks different. We write a prompt and receive an analysis, a solution, within seconds. As a result, our role changes. We spend less time generating answers and more time evaluating them. This can be incredibly useful, but several recent studies suggest that people often invest less cognitive effort when they trust an AI system. The more reliable the system appears, the more tempting it becomes to accept its reasoning instead of working through the problem independently. And that matters because certain mental abilities are maintained only through active use. Critical thinking does not develop by reading good answers. It develops by tolerating uncertainty, evaluating arguments, identifying mistakes, and forming independent conclusions. If AI increasingly performs that groundwork, our role may gradually shift from problem solver to supervisor, from thinker to quality inspector. And perhaps the greatest risk is not that machines become smarter than humans, but that humans become less frequently required to use their own intelligence. If that is true, we should see the effects most clearly in education. 4. The education experiment. Nobody meant to run learning is where thinking is trained. It is where the difference between understanding something and simply accessing information becomes visible. Today, millions of students use AI systems every day. They use them to explain assignments, summarize content, generate essays, and solve problems. The goal is obvious: learn faster, achieve better results, save time, and in many cases it works. Research reveals a fascinating paradox. With AI, people often perform better. Without AI, those same individuals sometimes perform worse. At first glance, that sounds contradictory. But performance and learning are not the same thing. AI can improve performance immediately without necessarily improving long-term understanding. That distinction is crucial. AI can explain concepts, demonstrate solution paths, correct mistakes, and provide useful feedback. But understanding develops when the brain actively builds connections for itself, when it struggles, makes mistakes, tests ideas, and gradually forms its own mental models. That means a student can submit an excellent AI-assisted solution while learning less than someone who wrestled with the problem alone. This does not mean AI prevents learning. It means better performance does not automatically equal deeper understanding, and that makes the trend difficult to notice. From the outside, everything looks like progress. Better grades, faster solutions, higher productivity. The real question is what remains when the tool is gone. But learning is only part of the story. The deeper question is whether AI influences not only what we know, but how we think. 5. AI is starting to shape how we see reality. Most people worry that AI might eventually make decisions for us. Some researchers suspect the more important risk is subtler. Not that machines make our decisions, but that they gradually influence how we arrive at those decisions ourselves. Research suggests that repeated interaction with AI systems can create feedback loops. People do not simply absorb information. They may also adopt patterns of communication, reasoning, and problem solving. Not because they are forced to, but because repeated exposure shapes human behavior. This can influence how people evaluate information, risks, and social situations. At the same time, researchers have discovered another interesting paradox. On an individual level, AI can increase creativity. People often generate more ideas and overcome creative blocks faster. But when large numbers of people use the same systems, outputs can become more similar. Individuals become more creative. Groups become more homogeneous. And that raises a new question. What happens when billions of people increasingly rely on the same digital tools to generate ideas? Because diversity is not only about different people, it is also about different ways of thinking. After all these studies, it would be easy to conclude that AI is destroying our ability to think. But that is not what the research says. The evidence does not suggest that AI automatically makes people less intelligent. It suggests something else. The brain adapts to the tools it uses. That was true for writing, for books, for calculators, for search engines, and now possibly for AI. The important question is not, does AI change the brain? Of course it does. Every tool changes us in some way. The more important question is, which abilities do we continue to train, and which do we gradually stop exercising? Because the same technology can have very different effects. Someone who uses ChatGPT to avoid difficult thinking develops different habits than someone who uses it to challenge ideas, identify blind spots, or discover new perspectives. AI can either replace thinking processes or help strengthen them. The technology itself does not decide that. We do. And that may be the most important insight from all these studies. The greatest danger is not a machine that suddenly becomes smarter than humans. It is the small decisions we make every day about when to think for ourselves and when to hand the work over to our tools. Because in the end, one question remains. Which parts of your thinking have you already delegated to AI without noticing? A few decades ago, London taxi drivers had to memorize thousands of streets. Their brains adapted to that task. Then GPS arrived. We no longer had to remember as many routes. Today, something similar may be happening, only this time it is not about navigation. It is about thinking. So far, research does not show that AI automatically makes people dumber. It shows that the brain adapts to the tools it uses. Perhaps AI will expand our thinking. Perhaps it will unlock abilities we would never have developed otherwise. Or perhaps we will slowly become accustomed to no longer performing certain mental tasks ourselves. Not because we have to, but because we can. And perhaps that is the real point. The greatest danger of AI is not that it will one day think like a human. It is that we may one day stop thinking about certain things ourselves. And if that happens, we probably will not notice the moment it occurs. Which ability would you never give up to AI?